Welcome back to Breaking Math. I'm your host, Autumn Fneff, and as always, I'm joined by my co host, Noah John Syracuse. Today, we're asking a question that sounds like it belongs in the 1890s, but it turns out to be very much about our AI saturated present. When a small handful of people control the infrastructure everyone else depends on, who gets to hold them accountable? A century ago, that infrastructure was the railroad. Today, it might be an algorithm or a foundation model. Our guest is Marc Dunkelman, a fellow at Brown University and author of Why Nothing Works, which was named the best book of the year by both the Financial Times and the Economist. Marc has spent years studying why a country that once built subways, dams, and moonshots now struggles to build almost anything. And his answer turns out to have everything to do with how we might govern AI.
All right, so your latest book is called Why Nothing Works, and it's largely about the ebbing and waning of power and efficacy of the U.S. federal government. But let's start by exploring some passages of that book that helps us set the stage for our discussion around technology today. You write that, quote, "It's difficult today to appreciate the menace of the old robber barons posed more than a century ago. 21st century tech executives may control flows of information. They may manipulate the items we put in our virtual shopping carts. But the robber barons looming over the late 19th and early 20th century trusts wielded much more power over the public's access to the basic necessities of life: oil, sugar, tobacco, steel, and much more." So I want to ask, as our lives become increasingly lived online, increasingly touched by AI in particular, do you think what you wrote there is still true and will remain true? Or at some point, is that going to flip? Will the Elon Musks be more powerful than those robber barons of yore?
I mean, my general view is that the degree to which ordinary Americans had access to ordinary things will not change that much in AI in the coming years of AI. The degree to which you would live in a small town in Ohio and be utterly dependent on the one train line that came to your part of Ohio and were totally at the whim of the executives out east on how frequently they were going to send a train that way, what they were going to charge for a passenger or for whatever it is that you were trying to export to Europe, grain, what have you, like just the sort of the nuts and bolts of your life were dependent on these people who you had no real leverage on, back in the turn of the 20th century. And that feels to me like it's sort of an all-encompassing power that even AI, I wonder, will have. Now, I thought a different guy was going to be nominated for president in 2024 on the Republican side. And so like my powers of prediction are pretty limited. But even that being said, just the degree to which these railroads in particular were to sort of 19th century America what the Catholic Church was to medieval Europe, like I just don't expect AI to become that powerful in like how you get milk. But I guess I could be wrong.
And even outside of AI, I mean, I wake up, I go on my phone, so I'm using an Apple product. I'm looking at social media that's run by Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk. It just feels like everything I do, and maybe I buy my milk through Amazon, which goes through Jeff Bezos, feels like everything I do is filtered through like 5 very wealthy white men who are kind of these modern day robber barons. So even before we get to AI, I still feel like tech is so dominant, but you're kind of pushing us to think we're overlooking the basic necessities and needs. Like most of my day, I'm sleeping in a bed, I'm driving my car. Like most of my life is still kind of offline and not so directly filtered through these modern barons.
Yes, in the sense of AI, you are right that like corporate conglomerates could change and evolve in different ways and control various parts of the economy. There were basic necessities that were dominated by trusts at the late 19th century in ways that I don't see quite the same. I don't see quite the same analogy. That being said, I don't want to minimize the power of these huge tech behemoths. But I think there is a difference, and one which I think prompts some of the same questions. I think that the question of at a moment at the turn of the 20th century when government was really a small, at a moment in the beginning of the 20th century when government was a shadow of what it would become, we now have a moment where it seems like it's the Wild West on AI and tech. And we are asking ourselves questions similar to the questions that people at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century were asking, like, is there some sort of public-facing, publicly responsible agency, authority, institution that can protect us from the worst of the private sector's impulses? And I think like there is sort of an echo today of that same question.
So I know that some privately led projects of the past have been brought back into the public realm. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because we can see some parallels in there as well.
So, today we are facing a whole series of challenges, particularly in our competition with China, that are reflections of global competitions of yore. So, if you look back to the beginning, sort of as we ramped up to World War II, um, there was a massive confluence of private and public interests being put in combination and in coordination in ways to serve the public interest in ways that we will need to do again. I think today in some realms. So, I think Operation Warp Speed, which has been forgotten because I think for a whole bunch of political reasons, we don't talk about so much, but like what an incredible accomplishment to have come up with a vaccine in such little time, with the government helping to mobilize mass production and distribution of science being done largely in private labs that have been supported by public dollars in some cases. Like it's not totally dissimilar from what DARPA has done with advanced weaponry and with the internet, or the ways in which the War Industrial Board from World War One or the various efforts during World War II worked to use the broad shoulders of America's private sector to propel the national interest. And I think what we're discovering is that certainly in the 25 years or the slightly longer since the Cold War, that there became a more hardened separation between the private and public sectors, so that they were suspicious of each other and we're certainly not working in collaboration, but we're unable even to speak the same language. And so I think we're going to see, in the way that the CHIPS program worked really to incredible effect to bring semiconductor manufacturing here. And if you hear the stories from the guys who ran that program, you realize that there were all sorts of intragovernmental barriers to actually getting that done, from environmental concerns to labor concerns to childcare concerns, that sort of stood in the way of an expeditious rollout of public dollars supporting what would be privately created, very sophisticated semiconductors. And that was something that was old hat, right? In earlier ages of American capitalism, the government and the private sector were sometimes in cahoots in ways we would probably find suspicious today. And the military industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about in the late 50s or early 60s, like that was a real source of consternation by the 60s and 70s. But like there's a portion of that dynamic that will need to come back if we're going to be able to combine sort of the wisdom and ingenuity of the private sector with the broad public interest in protecting the country and driving progress.
So one of the interesting things I found you highlight in your book is, as a novice, let's say, I'll put myself in that category, to this sort of political history, is I naively thought there was basically this argument of big government versus small. And basically either you believe the government can do good, and this is descendant of roots of FDR's New Deal, et cetera, that, yeah, if we work together, we can do things, and warp speed is maybe a great example. Or, oh, we don't trust the government. It's corrupt. It's going to muddle everything up. Let's get government out of the way so it doesn't interfere with industry. And that is a big through line in your book for sure. But I was really struck by when you brought in Judge Brandeis, where you mentioned there's this other view that actually big government is bad and big industry is bad. And that
Yeah.
we just don't sort of trust any accumulation of power, whether it's private or public. I'd love to hear more about that because I think that's less familiar to a lot of people. And especially as we think about where we sit now, where there are a few tech companies. We discussed already the individuals like the Elon Musks and the Mark Zuckerbergs, but the companies themselves are enormous and very powerful and dominating so much of our life. And as AI continues to grow and proliferate, likely that'll continue. So I think we're at an interesting juncture where OpenAI and Google and a few other companies have so much power. So we have big business.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of focus on government. For instance, the Trump administration has an interesting recent pivot where earlier they were saying, oh, let's be very hands-off and not regulate AI. And now, just weeks ago, the pitch was sort of changing to, we got to really vet this stuff and make sure it's safe. We don't necessarily have to comment on the details of that, but just this larger idea that we're focusing so much on the government and its size and its role. But what about industry and the larger picture of how power is concentrated? So if you can start with the past, because I think our listeners and myself included don't know
Yeah.
that as well. So inform us, and then we can bring it up to the present.
So in the 19th century, America lived in what one scholar's called island communities. Like if you lived, a few miles away from the next town, like it was a real distance. And so people really lived in communities and they knew each other and like they sort of were codependent on the people that lived near one another and were sort of isolated from other places. And the railroads just totally changed that. Suddenly you could get between one town and another or get your goods from one place to another part of the country or even to Europe, like pretty expeditiously. And these few, like a handful of railroad companies, the New York Central, the Baltimore and Ohio, most notoriously the Pennsylvania Railroad, were just incredibly powerful. And they sort of changed the way Americans thought about the economy because they, like, in the face of having these incredibly powerful railroads that could set prices and timetables and routes and completely dominate what any individual's trajectory was on the socioeconomic ladder, there was a question of like, who controls whether the railroads are actually acting in the public interest. It had been in the 19th century when you were living in island communities that you had courts and you had political machines and parties that would be able to mediate between some dominating force in your island community. But the railroads were much bigger than that. And the federal government was as I said, a shadow of the behemoth it would become. So there was sort of no one there. And so
I just
there's
want
this
to interject
debate.
because this is an interesting parallel that I hadn't thought of before. But the way you're describing is that these companies have so much influence over the everyday life, they can really tip the scales, benefit certain populations and individuals. It just seems
Yeah.
so similar to discussions we hear today around algorithms, right? That Amazon can tweak its algorithm or Google or Facebook, and our whole world changes, and some people rise and some fall. So I never realized this was not algorithmic, but is a very similar dynamic where one person or one company can really impact our lives and shift that balance. That's interesting.
And the algorithm, like now the algorithm is, is something in code. Like then it was that the Pennsylvania Railroad realized that this leg of its route between New York and Chicago was more expeditious than this other potential leg. And so they abandoned that leg. And then the people who were on that, that in that part of the country that where the leg that's been abandoned suddenly have no way, or it's much more expensive for them to get their goods to market and they're competing with people. Right.
It's
That
so
is
similar to an influencer. The algorithm
It-
gets tweaked and
of
suddenly
course.
you can't reach an
Absolutely.
audience. That's amazing.
Absolutely.
I never thought of
It's
this.
exactly the same. And so then the question is, among people who are concerned about this dynamic, should we, one, break up the big railroads so that we have competition among them, whatnot, or that John D. Rockefeller, who runs Standard Oil, but basically has a deal with one railroad, or the Vanderbilts, who control the New York Central. These various families aren't as powerful. Or do we create a big government bureaucracy that can oversee the railroads and say, no, you cannot just willy-nilly eliminate service from this part of the country, or charge double the rate because this other company has decided to get out of that market, whatnot. So, these are two different approaches to the same problem of concentrated power. One is to break them up, and the other is to regulate them. And today we conflate those two ideas, right? We hear antitrust and regulation as almost the same thing, but they're entirely separate approaches to this problem of what do you do about concentrated private power. And within the community of people who wanted to do something about the railroads, there was real debate here. If you are the Port of Boston or an exporter from Boston, and your real competition is exporting grain to Europe from the Port of New York, or the Port of Baltimore, or the Port of Philadelphia, the question of whether there is a single railroad line that goes from the Midwest into Boston, or whether that railroad is broken up into smaller railroads so that the grain has to be transferred over and over again. But before getting to the Port of Boston, you want to maintain that one monopoly, right, of railroads, because you are in competition with these other cities, these other ports. Whereas others are saying, no, we should break up the railroads so that they're right. You can imagine that people with similar goals of trying to democratize the economy and making sure that there aren't these powerful figures who can do sort of run people ragged. But what is the right approach? And we set up different institutions, but in the late 1800s, the Interstate Commerce Corporation, which no one remembers today, but was the first big regulatory body of the federal government. It's created, I think, in the late 1880s. And the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is the first effort to give the government the power to break up big businesses, is 1890. So they're passed, within a few years of one another, and they embody these two different approaches. One's of a top-down regulatory approach of the Interstate Commerce Corporation, one sort of a bottom-up, let's break up the big businesses through what you would Justice Brandeis had this aversion to bigness, and was known for wanting to bring down big, powerful railroads. In the New Haven was the notorious railroad in the Northeast, and Brandeis had gone to war with the New Haven as a private lawyer. So the history here is that the antitrust thing, the anti-monopoly effort to break up these businesses, is sort of there's a lot of talk in the first decade of the 20th century about that, and Taft does a bunch of it. Theodore Roosevelt is in favor of some of it. But by the time you get to the 1910s, it's the other idea, namely that we should build up bureaucracies that can interact with these businesses and make sure that they're doing the right thing, becomes sort of the prevailing ethos. And you see that the clearest example of that, and it's still with us today, is the Federal Reserve Bank, right, which regulates banks. It is a very powerful independent bureaucracy, and that becomes sort of a model passed in during the Wilson administration. So, the second half of the 1910s, that becomes a model for how you do these things. And you get the Federal Trade Commission, and all of the New Deal's various, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the Commodities Futures Trading Corp. All of these various bureaucracies are all modeled on this idea that we should have strong regulatory bodies that will allow for consolidation in the industry, and not necessarily break up huge companies like General Motors or Chrysler or whatnot, but at the same time will not let the public be harmed. And so that's sort of a debate within circles of reformers about how to do it. And that same debate is is alive and well today. Like there are these questions: should we be breaking up these big, these big tech companies? Like, would be better off if we broke Amazon into several smaller companies? What would that mean when those smaller companies try to compete with behemoths in China? Or do you lose the network benefits of a social network like Facebook or Instagram, owned by Meta? If you break up those companies, are they at a loss against TikTok? Or should we have stronger regulation to make sure that they are not, double dealing when dealing with customers, in the sense that they are, somebody tries to sell something on Amazon Marketplace, and then Amazon realizes that they can manufacture at 10% less and then sell and undercut on but by the algorithm, and pull that money away. Like there are pros and cons to both approaches. And we're still having this debate, but in my view, the discourse loses the nuance of to your point. Like, it's either people want big government and think the public sector should own these things, and we should nationalize everything, and push out private enterprise, and on the other hand, there are people who think that any government intervention is bad. I don't think that's where most Americans are. I think most people see that there needs to be a balance here, and I think that's where we'll end up. The American way is to debate these things and then come out with some sort of solution.
So something that I noticed, even let's take New York City, New York State, they've tried to
Yeah.
build an infrastructure since essentially like the 1960s, right? That can be everything from their power grid that brings into the Northeast all the
Mm-hmm.
way into railroad lines, the city, and how it's a major port. Now, you take that, expand that even more for a larger problem that they have when they're implementing a new infrastructure. This can be seen no matter which way you go about it. So take even Meta as a larger corporation. When you're looking at power being distributed or even redistributed, what is the centralized problem that we see there? Is it a lack of money? Is it a lack of leadership? Imagination? Maybe something deeper?
It's a
Where
terrific question. The core problem is that there's no one to decide. I was just talking about how in the latter half of the 20th century, um, uh, we got to a point, I should say, really after the post-war period, where we were really into the sort of the Fed model, right?
Yep.
We had the Tennessee Valley Authority that was bringing power lines through public resources to poor farms in the Upper South. Like, that was sort of the idea among many reformers, was how do we centralize power so that we can do things expeditiously on the public side. You get to the 60s and 70s, and like a lot of those same reformers see what the public sector has done,
Mhm.
and they're pretty disgusted by the way that, like, we put DDT on plants, and that we did urban renewal, which turns into a disaster by pushing poor people out of the neighborhoods where they're native, and we do urban highways, which destroy lots of vibrant neighborhoods. And we get involved in the Vietnam War and Watergate. And by that point, the sort of idea that we're going to have centralized public decision makers who are part of the establishment and are going to make decisions for us is so out of vogue that everyone is trying to distribute decision-making authority to ordinary people so that they can be protected against the people that want to ram a new train line through their backyard or build electrical wires across their kids' elementary school. And so today, what you find is that no one has the authority or power to be able to make hard decisions. Like, how are we going to get clean power from the places where in the Midwest across the country into the places where people are going to expend that power? Like, the wire has to go somewhere. Should it go through like the beautiful forest? Should it go through the nice historic neighborhood? Should it go through the neighborhood where people who are redlined decades earlier have all congregated. Like, someone has to make that choice, and there's no one to make it. So, to like your point about New York City, I don't think like we can argue about the 3 extra stops we now have on Second Avenue in Manhattan, or the extension of the 7 line to 34th Street. There have been some minor improvements to the broad infrastructure in New York City, but like there's been no major augmentation to the city, to the city's transportation infrastructure since like the Verrazano Bridge was built in like the late 60s. And the reason that that's so hard to do now is for the same reason that it was so hard to do congestion pricing there, where they wanted to impose new fees. This is an idea introduced 20 years ago to impose fees on people who were going to drive their cars into the central business district of Manhattan. Who was supposed to decide whether we were going to do that or not? Was it the mayor? Was it the governor? Was it the head of the transportation agency? Was it the president of the United States or the secretary of transportation federally? Like, was it the New Jersey and New York governors together through the Port Authority? Like, it to this day, you can't really point to the person who is like, you get to decide whether we're going to do this or not. And in the absence of like having a clear set of organizational imperatives where people are making these decisions and trading off the interests of the people who don't want to pay the extra fees versus the extra tolls that are going to go into transportation infrastructure, or how much does the public gain from being able to drive through Manhattan without a zillion cars during the middle of the work week. Like in the absence of someone being able to make those choices, we aren't making the choices. And it would be like if a private company had, an engineering division and a sales division and a marketing division and a tech division. And when all of those divisions didn't agree on what to do next, the company did nothing. What you need is some structure, some ability to take all of the concerns, funnel them into some decision maker's hands, have that person make the trade-offs, and then make a decision. That's how the private sector generally works. It's how the public sector once worked, probably too much. Like there's a famous book called The Power Broker in New York City about how the people who were making those decisions were not being cognizant of the environment, or cognizant of the importance of having mass transit versus roads, or cognizant of the interests of but those are the two things we need to balance, is basically having one person be making decisions without considering public input on the one hand, and on the other hand, being so caught up in everyone wanting their own thing that we can't do anything. And I think the challenge for America today, and generally, is how do we give people a voice without giving them a veto? And that is sort of the next challenge for how we resolve the same debate we were having about the railroad barons in the late 1890s. Like, how do we create a system where we can build railroads and we've got expeditious transportation throughout the country, but we are not beholden to the decisions of a bunch of guys who are, wearing monocles and top hats in Philadelphia? And we'll see where we go. But I mean, I think that's a challenge that just gets underplayed.
Mark, you have a great quote in your book that I think really encapsulates what you're just discussing, what Autumn nicely asked about, which is government today suffers from an endemic diffusion of authority. And to me, that really is like a pithy way of saying, like, we've just spread out our authority. What I want to ask is, thinking back about AI again now and where we're sitting today, no matter how you or I or anyone feels about it, there is a lot of big possible outcomes. Maybe it ushers in an era of an abundance, or maybe it takes away lots of jobs. Maybe it goes rogue. Maybe there's bioweapon threats. There's many very big positive, very big negative, everything in between possible outcomes. To me, I'm sort of like you. I don't want to predict. I don't want to weigh in too heavily. I don't want to debate specifics like UBI, but I feel like we are at perhaps a historical moment where we might need more authority. We might need a bolder government to help organize our movement forward. This idea that, we've endemically diffused our authority so much that we can kind of argue and nothing gets done feels like a dangerous moment when AI is accumulating so much power. So I guess my question is, looking back historically, do you see any precedents for how we can undo that diffusion? Is there any way to recollect authority in ways that don't lead to totalitarianism and fascism and all the bad things?
So, I mean, a classic example of this is the Port of New York, which was a mess and full of racketeering and corruption. And there was a fundamental competition between New Jersey and New York, and they were charging different rates. And they were, it was a chaos in the Port of New York at the turn of the 20th century. And so, in the spirit of the ICC, which had been created to regulate the railroads nationally, we created the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and that Port Authority was a centralized institution which would regularize the rates and sort of organize the port so that it would work economically and productively for all the private operators who were setting ships in and out of what was the country's most important port. You see that pattern over and over again. You see that in the Tennessee Valley Authority, like I mentioned. You see it in NASA. You see it in DARPA. You see it in more recently in the CHIPS program or in the Warp Speed. You see it continuing in the Fed. Like, there is certainly precedent in America, not that we nationalize industries, but that we create a framework by which we can not manage competition is sort of a lousy phrase for it, but that there can be leadership that establishes standards, punishes bad actors, and ensures that what is happening in private industry is benefiting the public at large. And we go back and forth on this. There have been times, in the 1970s where there used to be the Civil Aeronautics Board, which regulated the airlines and was, it had the power to allow for an airline to uh, to extend a new route, and what they could charge. And the view was at the time that, like, this was necessary to ensure that smaller cities were served, and we were subsidizing service to smaller places that wouldn't be served by the airlines by ensuring that there was adequate profit made on the more profitable routes. And the feeling across the board during the 1970s was the Civil Aeronautics Board had been captured by the airline industry and was not actually serving the public, and people were being charged more for tickets, and there was less service than if we eliminated that regulation. And so it's a very natural ebb and flow in American life that there are moments where we say we do need a centralized authority to help us manage the growth of a huge industry and a new challenge in American life, like AI. And that there are moments where we say to ourselves, the regulator here is not actually doing a great job, and we need to restore more authority and more decision-making power to industry itself. And I think, to your point, we don't know where things are headed with AI. It does seem like an extremely powerful technology. I mean, in that sense, I think that people had this feeling about nuclear weapons in the 1940s, and we created the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which was initially chaired by the same person that had chaired the Tennessee Valley Authority and extended power to all these poor farmers, so who understood centralized power, and name was David Lowenthal. But the point here is that, this is a very natural and reoccurring phenomenon in American life, and that we're right to have the debate about what the right public approach is to an emerging technology.
So that also makes me think, at what point do we take over for power from government? Should they be the ones in control for new emerging technologies? Think of this even with medical care or even whatever product that we're going to push out next. It doesn't necessarily have to be AI, but where do we need to have those guardrails where the government steps in?
So I think that there is both a public and a private role, and that we should be thinking about what the balance is at any given moment, right? Like, the reason that Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley today is because before there were tech behemoths there were defense contractors who were developing technologies for the military, and they were investing heavily in companies that were there south of San Francisco, and that has largely worked to our benefit. Like, GPS is a military technology that has now been, is integral to so much of what we do, and I think that that you want to be both wary of the military industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about before the Kennedy administration came in, and you want to be wary of the alternative, which is that, as you heard Silicon Valley complaining for years that there are no engineers in Congress, or very few engineers in Congress, and they didn't understand what the challenges were in the technological field. And people would fly out from the West Coast to talk to regulators and members of Congress in Washington, and it was like talking to people who had no grounding in any of the stuff at all. You want to have some integration. You want the people who are charged with the public good to be talking to people who are, um, determined to build value. And like those are both important things that are in tension and should be in tension. And you don't want to have a system like they have in China, where it is all controlled essentially by one organization, and they, there is no counterbalance to the say of the CCP. And you also don't want to have a system in which government is so incompetent that, that the proclivities of a few tech titans are allowed to run amok over the interests of the general public. And, figuring out how to titrate those two conflicting demands is not an easy job. And like, it does seem at the moment as if, certainly in the world of AI, we want to have some broader public involvement, so that if there is misbehavior, we have a red button to stop something terrible from happening, and that is wielded by some institution that is answerable not to shareholders but to the general public. At the same time, you don't want to take away the profit incentive, and like there's a real benefit to the fact that you've got Sam Altman and the folks at Anthropic and the folks at Gemini and and Grok, and they're all competing to improve this technology in ways that would benefit humanity as a whole. And so but that is, it is not a black and white story about one approach being all good and another approach being all bad. It is, how do we properly manage it so that we have the benefits of the railroads, and we're able to get from little towns in Ohio to the coast and get that grain shipped across to Europe, without giving so much power to the railroads that they can leave entire communities behind. And these are not easy things, but the sort of good versus bad is not the way to think about it, I think.
So to kind of amplify what you're saying there, one through line I'm getting in your answers, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, you seem very much to be a pragmatist. That rather than thinking there is one way that we should distribute power, that we should govern, that we should organize society, you don't seem to be allied with any of the particular camps or ideologies, as much as saying life is complicated. There are a lot of factors, and we just have to really recognize the complexity of our situations and think carefully and analyze that there's no simple solution to these problems we face. And I think that's really interesting, because I think a lot of times, I'll be a little opinionated here, a lot of times in Silicon Valley, there is this desire to find a simple solution. If we throw enough money or technology or AI or optimize, that we can just kind of push past the complexity of the world. So I think it is really valuable to have I'll call you a historian, to kind of remind us that sometimes you really have to get into the weeds and really think about the nuances of the world we're in. And there is no single simple answer.
I think that's right. I was having a really interesting conversation the other day with a former legislator in Massachusetts, actually, who was explaining to me how school construction funds in the state of Massachusetts are distributed essentially by formula. And you have different communities that get different rates of reimbursement depending on the district and the wealth in that district. And then there's a series of needs. And each year you sort of go through the list and people are awarded what they are needed essentially by algorithm.
Yep.
And that's sort of an interesting model, but it does not work for transportation systems, right? Because transportation systems are incredibly expensive, and there are so many factors involved in whether you build out a rail line to where Autumn lives, or to a different part of the state, or you enhance service here, or you connect North and South stations in Boston, which are, serve different communities. Like there are all sorts of challenges, and you cannot decide it easily by algorithm. That being said, there's a real place for technology here and for math, in the sense that we should be having debates about where we build transit based on how many more housing units we'll be able to build in a community that's housing starved and where housing is too expensive, or how much carbon will be taken out of the atmosphere if people move from their cars onto trains because the trains are faster or more accessible. Um, uh, how many how much less how many fewer tailpipe emissions will we have if we make one change or the other. And at the moment, like, AI could be very useful in that realm, in the sense that we would be able to have some sense of, like, of all the projects you could do around Boston or around the Bay Area or around Salt Lake City, like which one would bring down housing costs most effectively. And, like, that shouldn't be determinative. We should not be allowing algorithms to determine how we're going to invest in infrastructure generally. But, like, there are ways that math could inform public policy decisions today in ways that they really aren't. And I think that that's a challenge that we need to address head on.
So now I'm curious, are there any lessons of the past that you think people are overlooking as we confront the challenges of today?
Today, there is a discourse about the solution always being to devolve power to ordinary people. There's a conversation that we have in the public, is that, there are behemoths who are powerful, and there are the rest of us. And the solution is to give ordinary people more authority and more opportunity to have their voice heard. And in some cases, that is absolutely the right approach. But in too many cases, what we're finding is that individuals need to be able to invest their authority in somebody who speaks for all of them, and to make decisions that serve the public. And so the impulse that a lot of my peers have in the world of politics, to devolve power in all cases to ordinary people, so they can stop the housing development that they don't like in their neighborhood, or stop the high voltage transmission line that might go, a few miles across the gorge that they like to visit on the weekends, or what have you. Like, government should not be turning a deaf ear to what ordinary people think, but nor should ordinary people be so powerful that no decision can be made. And so I think the lesson is, we're at a moment in history where too much power has been spread too thin. And so we're not able to react with the speed and alacrity that's required to emerging challenges like AI.
That's our conversation with Marc Dunkelman. If there's one line you want to carry out from this episode, it's Mark's challenge for the whole century ahead. How do we give people a voice without giving them a veto? So until next time, stay curious and stay informed to the world around you.